condition appears to resemble something called transverse myelitis, which is a condition where the myelin sheath along parts of the spinal column is attacked and damaged. Because these two events were both neurological, and somewhat similar.
And they're also both, I guess, autoimmune, so some kind of adverse reaction may be the cause.
What's going to have to happen is the investigators are going to have to look both at the newest case and look back at the previous case to make sure that this is not something that is related to the vaccine.
I mean, the politicization of the vaccines has happened in Russia as well. We were talking a few weeks ago to a Russian journalist about the way that the vaccine there was apparently being rushed through. We have now at last seen the data from the Russian vaccine rather than just the president talking about it. But even there are some questions, it seems.
People are raising concerns about the publication itself. They've noticed that there are some what seem like abnormalities in the data where they have assessed that multiple people have the same antibody levels after their 21 days after vaccination and 28 days after vaccination. 9 out of 9 at one point in a group that they analyzed, and that really is not likely at all. Statistically, there's almost no way that could be true. So people are wondering whether or not the data have been manipulated, and they've written a letter to the Lancet asking them to review the situation.
So again, it sort of comes to this idea that I suppose those of us outside the business are clutching at straws, hoping that some kind of vaccine will come through, but the process cannot be rushed. And I suppose the bottom line is, for all these vaccines that are being tested, you have to know that they are safe for thousands and thousands of people, and you have to know that actually it will prevent, to some degree, the virus actually causing disease.
Yeah, and of course, one of the really important things here is trust, right? I mean, there is already a high level of vaccine resistance and hesitancy in many societies, and people are hearing about vaccines being produced in record time, and it's clear from polls that people are worried about how rushed a job this is. The choice of Operation Warp Speed, the U.S. government's campaign to fast-track vaccines, you can understand how it might have appealed to them to try to convey that they were on top of the situation, but it's creating anxiety at levels where people are going like, I don't know that I want a fast vaccine. I think I want a safe vaccine. There poll after poll is suggesting that people are worried about bringing vaccines through the process so quickly, and whether or not the vaccines are going to be safe as a consequence.
Helen Brown as well, and you can find all her reporting at statnews.com. Let's finish on another plague that's been raging since the beginning of the year, the plague of locusts that has been ravaging East Africa, Kenya in particular. Keith Cresswell, head of the UN's locust program, is in Kenya for the first time in months because of the COVID restrictions. And so we caught up with him during a break in his inspections of the anti-locust program.
Please keep to the right in half a mile.
Of course, is very good news. The weather was a bit colder than normal in northwestern Kenya, where the source of the swarms are. Yesterday afternoon, we did an aerial survey, and we saw a swarm on the side of a kind of a mountain in northwestern Kenya that was roosting on top of the trees. And this is about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Temperatures were only around 20 degrees, so it was already cool. The sun was out, but it was still cool. This morning, we came back to the same location that had been targeted for control operations. Although the sun rises here about 6 in the morning, by 9 o'clock it was still not warm enough for that swarm to fly away. Obviously, it's an excellent target for control. So it's these type of kind of weather conditions that really aid the control teams in decreasing those swarming populations, and then of course reducing any further migration to the north.
The last time I think we spoke was at the beginning of the growing season in East Africa. Obviously, you're very worried about the damage that could be done to crops. What's your assessment at the moment?
There has been losses, there has been damage, certainly on a local level, in some cases extremely heavy. Today we were in another part of the northern part of Kenya talking with village elders and asking them, what type of damage occurred when those swarms came in. And it was very interesting because the swarms,
Please keep to the right in 300 yards onto A501.
absolutely significant because it's what their animals rely on. And also had a side effect because as a result of no leaves on the trees, there's no flowering natural trees like the acacia trees, which meant that there's no wild.
Now keep to the right.
But they were not producing any honey. These have impacts on the local communities that can be very severe.
And just remind people, this is a situation that's not been seen in East Africa for decades.
Indeed, Kenya, they have not seen it in 70 years. These same village elders, I asked them, I said, when was the last time you'd seen locusts, before this year? They said they'd never, ever seen them in their lives. And these, of course, village elders are not youngsters, they are elder. They said they had remembered hearing about them from their grandparents, and some of the very old men that were still in the village could remember from the 1950s, from the early 1950s. And they said, if you see just a few locusts coming, don't worry, it's going to be grasshoppers and nothing to impact you. But if you start to see clouds of insects that follow, then your cattle and your animals are going to be hungry. And indeed, that was the case this year.
The reason that the swarms are there are because of the weather conditions at the beginning of the year, at the end of last year, that brought them in from further north in Africa, and then they were sustained by the wet conditions, which meant that they could swell their population. What is the prospect for the next few months?
The swarms now that are still present in northwestern Kenya, they're in the immature stage, so they're not ready to lay eggs yet. So their strategy has shifted. They will stay here in place in northwestern Kenya. It's still green, unusual green in some areas. They've had some recent rains, but they probably need a bit more rains to trigger their final maturation and then lay eggs. And this is likely to happen next month in October. There will be a third generation of breeding here, albeit it'll be much smaller than the first two generations earlier this year.
Keith Cresswell of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. It's hard to imagine it, but I do hope that by next week there'll be something rather more positive for us to talk about here on Science in Action. Do go to our webpage at bbcworldservice.com to find links to more on what we've been discussing today and for our past editions. I'm
Neil.
Service, where teenagers talk to technology's pioneers.
What do our most successful innovators think about the inventions they unleashed upon the world?
1,000 songs in your pocket. No one ever had that experience before.
Teenagers like me get to question the people who invented the tech we take for granted, finding out how they came up with their ideas and asking for advice.
World Wide Web, Sunday at 13 GMT. And in an hour, The Inquiry with Tanya Beckett. President Trump says opening up November's presidential election to more postal voting will make it more vulnerable to fraud. Will the vote be safe in this year's presidential election? News Hour is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to News Hour. It's live from the BBC World Service in London. I'm Tim Franks. Thousands of migrants remain without shelter on the Greek island of Lesbos after their camp was destroyed by fire. Germany says it will resettle some, but
the question for the future is it only 1,000 or will it be 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 or potentially 1 million as it was in 15-16?
Also, the row between Britain and the EU over changes to the Brexit agreement reaches a new level of rancour. And it's just been announced that peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban will start on Saturday. But in the run-up, there's been growing violence, especially directed at women.
I saw her crouching by a wall. That's where she had been fighting with the attackers. By the time I reached, they had all run away.
Those stories and others after this bulletin of news.
Hello, this is Danielle Yarowiecka with the BBC News. Britain has said it will not withdraw controversial legislation that the European Commission has urged it to scrap by the end of the month. A senior minister, Michael Gove, insisted the bill would not circumvent a key Brexit commitment on Northern Ireland. But after talks in London, the visiting Commission Vice President Maroš Šefčovič said that Britain had seriously damaged trust. More details from Leila Nafu.
It's useful to try and think of it as sort of two separate things going on at the same time. So there are already trade talks underway about the future relationship between the UK and the EU. They have been going on and on. The 8th round of those were taking place already in London today. There have been major sticking points in those discussions already, and now what's been thrown into the mix is going back to the divorce deal that's already been agreed. So that's thrown a huge spanner in the works when it comes to both that reopening that agreement and the implications of that, how that is going to be implemented, and now what it means for the future trade talks too.
Microsoft says it has detected and thwarted a series of cyber attacks from China and Russia, which have targeted November's US presidential election. In a security blog, Microsoft said the attacks had been directed at staff and organizations working on the campaigns of both President Trump and his Democrat rival Joe Biden. Officials in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo say 58 people have been killed by a rebel group called the ADF. Will Ross reports.
Officials in Ituri province say these attacks happened because the ADF rebels are under pressure from the Congolese military in neighbouring North Kivu province. But that will be of little comfort to the villages that have been left so vulnerable since the army went on the offensive late last year. The fact that the same community of Irumu was attacked on Tuesday and Thursday points to the lack of protection for civilians. The ADF is one of dozens of armed groups causing havoc in eastern Congo. On Friday, the country's defence minister and other government officials were due in Ituri to focus on the complex security challenges.
A Brazilian government official who had worked for decades with isolated indigenous tribes in the Amazon has been killed. He died as he approached a reservation in the state of Rondônia to assess reports of conflict in the area. Here's Leonardo Rocha.
Eli Franciscato had worked for more than 30 years for Brazil's indigenous agency FUNAI. A friend who was standing next to him said they were taken by surprise when the arrow hit Mr. Franciscato. It was 1.5 meters long and made of bamboo and bird feathers. Mr. Franciscato still managed to pull it out and run for about a minute before collapsing in the forest. Indigenous leaders say incidents with illegal miners, farmers and loggers on their ancestral lands have become much more common since President Jair Bolsonaro took office last year, promising to develop the Amazon region.
World news from the BBC. A huge fire raging in the Lebanese port of Beirut has taken hold in a warehouse where food aid is stored. The blaze is very close to the scene of a massive explosion last month, which devastated the heart of Beirut. President Trump has said his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, will attend the Afghan peace negotiations taking place in Qatar on Saturday. Mr. Trump's statement followed an Afghan Taliban announcement that it was ready to take part in the intra-Afghan talks. The militant group agreed to participate after Afghan government officials sent a final group of 6 Taliban prisoners to the Qatari capital, Doha. Jill McGivering has this report.
The exchange of prisoners on both sides became a complex
Please keep to the left in half a mile.
Man's list of about 5,000 detainees proved problematic, stalling the process for many weeks. The government, calling them serious criminals, referred the issue to a tribal council, which approved freeing them. Correspondents say some were convicted of high-profile murders, including of French and Australian nationals, and their governments object.
The US Treasury has announced sanctions against the Ukrainian politician Andriy Derkach over allegations that he attempted to influence the upcoming American presidential election. In May, Mr. Derkach released edited recordings which purported to implicate the Democratic candidate Joe Biden in corruption. In its statement, the Treasury said Mr. Derkach, who met President Trump's lawyer Rudy Giuliani in 2019, had been an active Russian agent for more than a decade. German and Italian warships have intercepted a tanker that was carrying jet fuel in a suspected breach of the international arms embargo on Libya. The vessel had come from the United Arab Emirates and was heading for the eastern Libyan port of Benghazi. It's a stronghold of the UAE's ally, General Khalifa Haftar, who's fighting the UN-backed government based in the capital, Tripoli. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour. It's live from the BBC World Service in London. I'm Tim Fricks. I'm going to head first to Greece, which has been the site of one of our big stories this week. Because after the destruction of Europe's largest migrant encampment, the immediate emergency and the longer-term problem remain unresolved. There are still thousands without any shelter after fires swept through the Moria camp on the Greek island of Lesbos. For the last 2 nights, people of all ages have been left sleeping on roads, in fields, in car parks. The Greek authorities are sending ships to help house the migrants. The government official Dr. Manos Logothetis did tell the BBC, though, it's just a stopgap.
The plan is that you have a contingency for vulnerable people, that is the boat.
Please keep to the left in 300 yards onto A501.
Here, solution of a new temporary camp. It will be a temporary camp, so it will be a tented camp. We have already tents here available for all the people that we need to help, but we are behind in finding a place to set up the tents, and this is because...
Now keep to the left.
Here.
Before the fire this week, many of the migrants, the large majority of them had come from Afghanistan, had endured perilous journeys, only then to be left, in some cases for years, living in squalor in a camp which was several times over capacity. There's a longer-term issue about where they should go and how they should be dealt with, and we'll look into that in a moment. But there is also the here and now, the humanitarian crisis facing them and the Greek authorities. Our correspondent Bethany Bell is at what's left of the Moria camp.
Well, we've seen a number of small fires break out at the site of the camp and also in the fields around where many of the migrants have scattered to sit under the trees and to sleep. And there have been helicopters trying to extinguish the fires, and really people bracing themselves this evening many people for another night of sleeping rough, because their tents have been...
Please keep to the left in half a mile.
And what we saw there was pretty comprehensive destruction. You could just see the sort of twisted and charred frames of tents that people have lived in, and on the ground things that people have left in their rush to get away, children's shoes, bits of food, pita bread and things like this. So a real sense that they're not going back to the camp. A few people have returned to try and salvage a few things that they'd left behind, but most people have left and are now in the roads and fields round about, but they're not being let through into the towns. There's a police line stopping them.
And in terms of the Greek authorities, I don't know how easy it is for you to get a sense of what they're doing or what they're planning to try and just deal with this immediate humanitarian emergency, but what sense do you have from them as to what they're doing in the very short term to try to rehouse these people?
Well, we've seen some deliveries of just basic food and drink to people either in the fields or outside. There was one supermarket we passed and the whole car park was full of people who were just sitting there or lying down trying to sleep. What we understand and what I've heard from humanitarian workers is that an attempt is being made to try and coordinate the aid effort, but what they were saying needed to be happening was another site has to be chosen to house these people, and that of course is very controversial in Lesbos, where many of the locals feel that it has been extremely unfair that they've had to shoulder the burden of looking after so many of these people, and in a camp that was extremely overcrowded. Moria was originally built for less than 3,000 people, and almost 13,000 people were there just a few days ago. So there is a lot of dismay, anger here among the locals on Lesbos about the sight of another camp. They would like to see people moved onto the mainland and to other parts of Europe, and it has to be said, a lot of the migrants would like that too.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, I'm sure a lot of those migrants are desperate and exhausted and probably a bit scared after having to flee the conflagration. But do you get a sense from any of them are saying, maybe now our status, given that we've been in suspended animation for...
Please keep to the left in 300 yards onto A501.
Inside Europe.
I think that's what a lot of people would like. Whether they're hopeful that that would happen, though, is another matter. You know, they have been there for a long, long time. They feel stuck. The islanders feel stuck as well. They feel as though they've been abandoned by the Greek government, by a lot of the rest of the European Union. So there is a sense that this was an untenable situation that now needs to change somehow. Whether it changes for the better, either for the migrants or for the locals, is still quite a big question.
Bethany Bell speaking to us from Lesbos. Of the 13,000 migrants who had been crammed into this camp, about 400 were unaccompanied.
Now keep to the left.
President Emmanuel Macron announced that they had agreed on a plan for EU member states to take in those children. The others, thousands at this camp, not to mention others in similar camps who remain in limbo. Jürgen Hart is a German member of Parliament for the governing party, the Christian Democrats, and is the party's spokesman on foreign affairs.
We are convinced that the European Union as a whole is able to take a lot of those refugees that are now in this crucial situation in Greece. We think that the quantity of refugees there is not too high for us all. It's too high for Greece alone, but it's not too much for the whole European Union. But we ask for a fair share of the refugees, for example, looking to the GDP or the inhabitants per country, and not only Germany and Luxembourg, which is the situation now. I think the German government should work hard on a project where a group of minimum 10 or 12 European Union.
Please take the first exit from the roundabout in half a mile, then keep to the right.
And we say from 1,000, Germany is taking, for example, 300 or 400, and others 50 or 100 on the basis of a fair algorithms. Unfortunately, we failed by doing that. Our concerns with the idea of taking now maybe 5,000 or 1,000 refugees from Greece is that we fear that this might become a role model for the next weeks and months. Camps in Greece will be filled up soon with new refugees from Turkey, and then we have to continue on that way. The question for the future is it only 1,000, or will it be 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, or potentially 1 million as it was in 15-16?
Jürgen Hart, senior MP with the CDU in Germany, saying more should be done for the humanitarian aid emergency in Lesbos. There shouldn't be a template for other migrants then to be resettled. Germany was famously welcoming back in 2015 when the Chancellor Angela Merkel oversaw the admission of 1 million migrants. What does her colleague Jürgen Hart's caution now tell us about where policy on asylum seekers is in Germany and indeed across the EU? Victoria Rietig is head of the German Council on Foreign Relations.
I think it definitely reflects the fear that we have in Germany and in other member states, or it's more two fears. He called it the fear that we become a role model. I think it's the fear of a pull factor. So if we take in thousands now, thousands more are going to come soon. But the other fear is that it will create path dependency. So if we keep stepping up as Germany alone or in a small group of willing member states, then the other member states are not going to step up at all. And I think those two fears are the dominating hindrances of why Germany and other member states have been so hesitant to take in numbers that are more than just.
Please take the first exit from the roundabout in 300 yards onto A5201, then keep to the right.
Yeah, everybody agrees the system is broken, but no one is really willing to do what it takes to fix it and step up to make it work, right? So, I mean, there's really three functions that a good European asylum system would need, and all these three basic functions we currently do not fulfill. And the one is the one that we just heard about, is the distribution of asylum seekers, right? A quick and fair distribution, that's what is needed. If possible, via a quote.
Now take the first exit from the roundabout.
Retail within Europe, because simply there are countries that are not willing to take in people. Function number two is you need to have a system that adjudicates asylum claims quickly and with comparable outcomes, right? But right now it's a total asylum lottery, so you have a chance to get protection that is much higher in some countries than in others. And while that is the case, asylum seekers want to go to where their chances are highest, not to where they are assigned to. And then the third point that is broken is that returns of those who do not receive protection should happen quickly and humanely back to their countries, but that is not working at all, in part because European countries themselves don't have good systems in place, but also because the countries...
Please keep to the right in 100 yards onto A5201. Now keep to the right.
Really deal with the big challenge.
Famously, Germany did take in these million migrants in 2015, and Angela Merkel announced, "We'll get by, we'll manage." That was her slogan. But has Germany managed?
Germany has dealt with this challenge remarkably well in the last 5 years. We have a lot of success stories to tell when it comes to labor market integration, right? About half of the people that arrive are in jobs. Nearly all the children are in school. Most of the people have moved from mass accommodation into private houses. But of course, it is not the case that all people that have arrived have integrated very well, and some groups are doing a lot less well than others. For instance, one group that isn't doing too well are the people that are either still waiting for an outcome to their asylum claim, or who have received a rejection to their claim but are still in the country because Germany either won't or cannot return them to their country, and they are in permanent legal limbo.
And in terms of the general political climate, are you able to take the political temperature?
Germany is divided on the issue of migration. There's no two ways about it. And anti-immigrant sentiment has grown in parts of the population since 1516. We have seen a rise in right-wing attacks and in violence, and we have seen greater support for the populist and far-right AfD. So that's all true. But it is also true that there's still a remarkable willingness of cities and states in Germany to step up and to say, we can take more, we are willing to take in more people. For instance, yesterday North Rhine-Westphalia announced they wanted to take 1,000 people. The state of Thuringia a few weeks back announced they were going to take 500. Berlin said, we're good with 300. But the problem here is that the decision lies with the Interior Ministry, and that has so far blocked these proposals.
Victoria Rita, head of the German Council on Foreign Relations, speaking to us from Berlin. You're listening to NewsHour, live from the BBC. The programme will hear from the author of a new biography, a major new work. It's about John F. Kennedy, on why America's 35th president still has resonance today.
One of the things that's remarkable about him, and I didn't expect this in my research, is that I think he was a more serious student of world affairs from an earlier point than I thought going in. I think he had read the questions about democracy articulated by people like Winston Churchill and by Walter Lippmann, and I think he had his own questions about it in the late 30s. It was a time of crisis for democracy. I think we're in one now.
An interview in 30 minutes. One headline from the BBC newsroom: Britain has rejected demands by the European Commission that it should withdraw legislation that overrides a key Brexit agreement. We'll hear about that in just a few minutes. This is NewsHour, live from the BBC. I'm Tim Franks. Just before we came on air, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Qatar announced that the first direct talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban will start in Doha on Saturday. That might be propitious news, but throughout the lead-up to the negotiations, fighting inside Afghanistan has continued, and a new tactic of assassinations has rattled officials and activists in the capital, Kabul. With a number of prominent women among the project as its future.
Please keep to the left in half a mile.
The fragile progress made on women's rights in the country. Secunda Kamani has this report.
On screen, she starred in and directed crime dramas. In real life too, Sabah Sahar worked with the Afghan police. As a woman in a conservative country, she helped push boundaries. But now she's recovering in hospital after being shot multiple times on her way to work. Her husband and fellow filmmaker, Imal Zaki, was the first person to arrive at the scene. As soon as I reached, I saw her crouching by a wall. That's where she had been fighting with the attackers. By the time I reached, they had all run away. I put my wife in my car and took her to hospital for first aid. Huge suicide bombings had become regular tragedies in Kabul. But ever since the Taliban signed an agreement with the United States earlier this year, there have been far fewer, at least in the capital. But that doesn't mean the bloodshed has ended. In recent weeks, there's been a spate of assassination attempts in the city, targeting pro-government or liberal figures. A number of them women, just like actress Sabah Sahar. Fawzia Kufi is a prominent politician and member of the team due to hold negotiations with the Taliban. She survived the shooting last month. The Taliban deny responsibility, but the attacks seem to be attempts to suppress strong voices ahead of crucial talks. Fawzia Kufi, though, insists she won't be silenced.
When it comes to expressing my views and being who am I do not think this will affect. In fact, it has given me more strength from a point of view where I could see that the whole public actually stood by me.
Men have also been targeted in the assassination attempts. Yesterday, a bomb exploded close to the convoy of the Vice President. No one's clear exactly who's responsible, but the attacks on female figures in particular are feeding into fears about what the future will look like for Afghan women. In a small bakery in Kabul, mother of three Razia stretches out lumps of dough to bake into pieces of long Afghan naan. Under Taliban rule in the 1990s, women weren't allowed to work. That's no longer the group's official policy, but like Razia, many still worry upcoming peace talks could mean a step backwards for women's rights. If the Taliban come into power, I don't know if I'll be able to continue here, she says. I have lots of problems at home. Treatment. If not me, who will support my family? Kabul is a city that has endured so much pain. There is cautious hope for peace, but also a great deal of fear and uncertainty.
That was Secunda Kamani reporting on the forthcoming Afghan peace talks in the background of violence in Kabul. Senior officials at the European Union have hit back strongly at the British government's plan to introduce new legislation to change the terms of its EU withdrawal treaty. British ministers argue that the new law, which would give the government unilateral power to regulate trade in Northern Ireland, is needed to uphold the peace process in the province. Brussels believes that the bill does the exact opposite and has called it an extremely serious violation of international law. After emergency talks in London, the EU called on the British government to reverse TAP before the end of the month or face legal action. Our Europe correspondent Nick Beak is outside EU headquarters in Brussels.
It's almost like 24 hours ago, the European Union couldn't quite believe what it was hearing, the fact that the British side, by its own admission, was prepared to break international law. But today you've had a very senior figure in the European Commission travel to London,
Please keep to the left in 300 yards onto A1202.
See that the EU EU's worst fears have been confirmed, and so cue this, devastating statement really, saying that the British side proposed to break international law, undermine trust, risk a future relationship, and, commit an extremely serious violation of the withdrawal agreement, the divorce bill, last year. So, I mean, it's really scathing.
Now keep to the left.
So this may just be some posturing from the British side, from the European side, the EU side, and that this...
Please turn left in 300 yards onto A1203.
Agreement get underway again.
Yeah, I think that's the context we've always got to bear in mind. But that said, if the European Union statement had, sort of left it at that, as we talk about, that would have been one thing. But the fact that the European Commission says that the whole sort of fundamental basis of Boris Johnson's plans for this bill is undermined, I think that takes it to another level, because they listened carefully to Boris Johnson say that this bill was actually about ensuring peace on the island of Ireland, and the EU has looked at that and they think his assessment's wrong, and actually it will do completely the opposite.